The chisel makes a sound like a small bone breaking. He was finishing the memorial stone for old Torbjorn, who died of a chest rot in the 4th week of winter, carving the saga name the man had asked for in the Elder Futhark along the outer border. Bjornfeeder, Frostwalker, names more generous than the life that earned them. The stone didn't judge. Halvard carved what he was given. That was the carver's code. He heard the Jarl's boots on the path before anything else. Jarl Runvalder Oskarsson walked the way men walk when they've decided something and are coming to tell you what it is. Halvard kept his chisel moving. Halvard set the chisel down. He turned to look at the Jarl. Broad-shouldered, 40 winters, face salt-burned from sea crossings, a great reddish beard braided with bone beads. Runvalder was not a cruel man. That was what made what followed more troubling, not less.
You want to honor someone.
He laid it out without self-pity. 3 failed raids, 41 men gone in 2 years, 2 ships splintered on Irish rocks, a 3rd burned by coastal defenders who'd had 4 hours to prepare. Lean winters, fire signals and bell towers, and an Irish coast that watched for Norse sails the way a man watches for the thing that already hurt him once. He left it there. The implications settled between them in the cold air like frost. He knew the rite in his body, not just his head. 43 funeral rites performed, memorial stones carved until his back ached and his eyes watered. The rite was his. He owned it the way a smith owns fire, and because he owned it completely, he could see, with perfect clarity, exactly which elements could be imitated without being real. He understood which parts could be faked.
And when those watching discover what the form concealed,
20 years of arguing that the funeral rite was what separated Norse warriors from the beasts of the field, that the passage mattered, that without the correct rite, the soul had no road to walk. He began to talk. He told himself he was only explaining the structure, the symbolic logic, which elements were load-bearing and which decorative. He told himself the Jarl would fill in the rest, and Halvard's hands would stay clean. When he finished, Runvalder thanked him, turned, walked back up the path. He told himself he'd wait. Watch what Runvalder did. Intervene if the thing actually became a plan. The Volva's dwelling sat at the settlement's edge, built half into the ridge stone, the kind of place that looked like it had grown there rather than been built. He knocked. She was already at her fire, stirring something that smelled of pine bark and iron.
I told Runvalder how the funeral rite works. He's going to use it as a disguise for a raid fleet. How could you...
The carving yard felt very far away. The chisel at his belt felt very heavy.
He asked you first. And he waited 2 years.
She said it without cruelty, which was worse than cruelty. She said it the way you say the direction of the wind. Halvard had always prided himself on reading her correctly. He read her perfectly now. Your principles were real. The Jarl found the number. That is the difference between a principle and a price.
The fleet, already prepared?
She produced a small clay pot from the shelf, palm-sized, sealed with pine resin, marked with the Kinaz rune. Torch. Opening. He'd seen it there before and assumed it was medicine. He recognized now what it was.
Then why didn't any of you? Why not keep choosing?
Then why didn't we keep
The fleet was 3 days out. The tide had been right, the wind had been right, and Runvalder was not a man who waited past the moment of maximum readiness.
Where are they sailing? I know of it. A monk there, Brother Peter, gave 3 weeks of hospitality to a Norse trader and asked nothing in return. Those monks are...
He walked from her dwelling to the harbor, where Geirfinnur Haftinsson, the Jarl's right hand, a broad and cheerful man who treated raiding with the same craft interest most men gave carpentry, was overseeing supply loading.
Carver, good timing. I had a question about the sea burial variant. If we needed to adapt the form for a fleet without a deck pyre, would torch staves alone be sufficient, or...
He told himself it was only clarifying what he'd already given, that the knowledge was out, that refusing Geirfinnur was like trying to unburn a fire by standing next to the ash. He walked back to the carving yard. He stood for a long time with the blade against Torbjorn's half-finished stone. From 20 paces, he could already see Geirfinnr sitting with a piece of bark, making neat and systematic notes. Halvard knew what happened at St. Cormac's Isle, the way you know things told to you by someone who had no reason to lie and every reason not to speak of them. Brother Peter had been in the sea tower when the fleet appeared. 3 ships, low in the water, moving slowly. The mourning oar pattern, drag and lift, 4 strokes per cycle. He'd seen it twice before from this same tower. Norse funeral flotillas giving the strait a wide berth, sailing in private grief through neutral water. Both times he had rung the processional bell in sympathy. It was what the monastery did. They rang for the dead, all the dead. He noticed the mourning runes on the torch staves were irregular. A learned man, he'd spent 3 winters teaching himself the Elder Futhark from scriptorium copies. The runes looked like they'd been carved by someone who knew what they were supposed to say, but hadn't internalized the forms. The first peal carried down the tidal flat. The monks understood. A Norse burial flotilla, neutral, to be given room and water, as had been their practice for 11 years without incident. The coast watchers on the headland heard the bell and did what 11 years of experience had trained them to do. They left their posts. You don't man a war watch for a funeral procession. That would be disrespect, and disrespect on the death road had consequences no coastal community wanted. The 3 longships altered course. The oars went to battle stroke. The torch staves came down. 3 ships crossed the tidal flat in the time it takes to say a short prayer, which is what Brother Peter was doing when he looked from the tower and saw the transformation. 40 monks, 2 years of grain, 11 years of manuscript work, bronze fittings on the chapel door. Runvaldr took all of it. The monks found their options narrow in the time it takes 3 longships to cross a tidal flat. They were not harmed beyond what the grain store doors required because Runvaldr was not a cruel man. The tactic's value was in the entry, not the occupation. They went for grain and bronze. They got both. Halvard watched the fleet return from the clifftop above Grvik. He hadn't gone to the dock. He stood there with stone dust still on his hands, and he watched 3 ships come in laden with what had been someone else's careful years. The fjord went copper in the late light. The ships looked fine in it. They looked like the kind of thing that gets carved into runestones. Halvard didn't need to go closer. The updated fleet position notes, the sea burial variant, refined by actual execution. The second version of the knowledge, cleaner now, corrected where theory had diverged from practice. A raven landed 3 arm spans from his feet, regarded him with one eye, then the other, and lifted off toward the shipmast below. Brother Peter had rung the bell for a funeral that wasn't a funeral. Somewhere in a stone tower, a man who'd spent 3 winters learning the Elder Futhark out of curiosity, who'd maintained 11 years of hospitality out of faith, had watched the oar pace change and kept ringing, because his hands were already on it, because the bell's voice had already gone out. He chose granite. The autumn after the raid, Geirfinnr sailed to Orkneyjad on a trading voyage and returned with 2 new friendships, ship captains from the northern settlements who'd heard him describe over 3 evenings of mead the most reliable approach to a defended coast they'd ever encountered. The following spring, a monastery on the Hebridean coast fell to a fleet that had appeared in the mourning oar pattern. Coast watchers had left their posts. A bell had been rung. That first winter after the raid, Soldis came by the carving yard, sat on the limestone outcrop and said nothing for a long time. Then, I've been thinking about the clay pot. She broke it against the outcrop's edge. Inside, a piece of birch bark, very old, runes still clear. The original inscription, the first account. The same mechanic Halvard had explained in plain speech to Runvaldr in this same yard. She left the birch bark and walked back up the path. She did not look at the granite slab. She understood exactly what he was going to do, and watching from a distance was her final form of care. He carved Grvik, the Winter Count, the Jarl's name, St. Cormac's Isle, then the account, the failed raids, the lean winters, the proposition, the hour of explanation in this same yard. He carved his own name in the role it deserved, not as the Jarl's tool, but as the knowledge's source. Halvard Grimson, stone carver, gave the form. He did not soften this. The stone wouldn't hold a soft version.
What stone is this for?
Mine.
You're carving your own memorial?
The most important stone I'll ever make. There's no difference.
He also recorded with some regret that Geirfinnur's improvised torchstave variant, oar handles wrapped in burning wool, as adapted by a northern sea captain who'd received the bark notes secondhand, had been described by a reliable witness as adequate, but clearly the work of someone who had never met an actual carver of memorial objects. He carved, "The torchstaves used in the execution were poorly formed. This is also my fault." The afternoon light moved across the yard in its slow northern way, the angle that made rune cuts cast long shadows. He was 3/4 through when Soldis appeared at the entrance, looked at the stone, looked at him, and walked away without a word. He reached the final section as the light thinned. His hand had worked 6 hours. His back was what 40 years of carving made backs, a record of the work, written in ache. He struck once, carved the final line, left the chisel in the stone. Not dramatically, he simply set it against the last rune and didn't pick it back up. The ravens were loud on the cliff. The fjord went copper. Up the path, Runvalder's longhouse was already warm with the grain from St. Cormac's Isle. Enough for 2 winters, possibly 3. He touched the chisel in the last rune, iron in granite, the mark made, the agreement honored. Somewhere north, another coast watcher's fire was going dark.